Black Rednecks and White Liberals. This is the book we're going to be breaking down in this series, and it's written by one of the great minds in recent history. This is economist Dr. Thomas Sowell, a PhD from Harvard University. And what this book addresses is the question of the existence of black culture and where it stemmed from. Is it a unique culture that was developed from the descendants of slaves? Or were there components of the black ghetto culture that were adopted from outside influence? Now, what many people have is the idea that black culture is a unique creation of just blacks themselves. And what Dr. Sowell is arguing in this book is that, hold on, there are aspects in black culture that do not come from blacks, right? They come from Southern whites, right? And that's what he's talking about. More specifically, the redneck and cracker culture. And when I'm going over the information, what I see is that it's a combination of both. Right, there are aspects that come from the cracker culture, the redneck culture, but there's also unique aspects that were developed from the enslaved blacks and were passed on. And that's largely due to that culture being a forced culture, right? So in addition to what was forced, they picked up ideas and cultural attitudes from the rednecks, which is what Dr. Sowell is going to argue in this book and provide his evidence for it. So we're going to open up this book here. We're going to go into chapter 1 and see if we can get some understanding.
These people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job. They flout the law constantly and neglect their children. They drink too much and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life.
So Dr. Thomas Sowell opens up the chapter in Black Rednecks, White Liberals by providing a quote from Indianapolis in 1956, and it's describing a group of people who are problematic in the city. They neglect their children, they won't keep a job, and they have low moral standards. Now, somebody may initially, when hearing this, assume that it's referring to black folks, but it's not. It's actually referring to those who are labeled as white, and more specifically, the southern whites who are coming up to the north to find work. Now, in the 1951 census, Dr. Thomas Sowell shows in this book that in Detroit, there was a 21% disapproval of the southern whites that came up to the north versus a 13% disapproval of those who are labeled as black. Now, what this is demonstrating is the attitude that the northerners had towards the southern whites who came up to the north to find work during World War II. And what Dr. Thomas Sowell is attributing to this disapproval type attitude toward those southern whites is the culture that they brought with them, right? This southern white culture that they brought with them, which he's saying that those black southerners also shared as well. Let's get some more.
What is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries, which has encompassed everything from ways of talking to attitudes towards education, violence, and sex, and which originated not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South. Then it largely died out among both white and black Southerners, while still surviving today in the poorest and worst of the urban black ghettos.
So in other words, when you go into the inner city and you go into what is known as the black neighborhoods, what you're seeing are people who have a mindset and a culture that Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying originated from the British Isles. And the people from the British Isles brought that culture over to the United States when they came. And then from there, the blacks during the time of slavery adopted a lot of those practices that came from the British Isles and some of those lowly areas over there. And it's still being kept alive today by the people in these urban areas within the black community. And he also mentions that much of that culture has died out. But you can still see that many people who are not even in the ghetto or don't even live in those areas, they still keep a lot of those practices with them, right? And they keep a lot of that mindset with them as well that you see in the in the ghetto black communities in the inner cities. Maybe not as much, but you still see it there because many of those people who come from those ghetto areas, they set the trends for the black community. Those become much of the leaders of the black community, right? And so they set the standards for the culture. And a lot of people feel, even if they don't come from that area, don't live in those areas, they feel like they have to take on many of those cultural practices and those mindsets in order to feel authentically black. And so here are some of the examples that Dr. Thomas Sowell provides that come from the southern redneck culture that some of the blacks picked up. Here we go.
Books, businesses, technology, and science were not the kinds of things likely to be promoted or admired in the world of the rednecks and crackers.
So we have books, technology, business, and science. These are some of the subjects that Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying that the old redneck culture did not look upon favorably and with admiration. And you can still see many of these attitudes largely prevalent in the black community, which had picked up a lot of those cultural practices, according to Dr. Thomas Sowell, from that old Southern culture, right? That was brought over from the British Isles. And the disdain for books, technology, and especially science, right? There's like a major abhorrence and almost like a hatred for science. And many people in there, not all of them, but many people in there. It's a large cultural attitude that Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying was influenced from the old cracker redneck culture, right? And also, I'm saying that it's also because education was cut off, right, during that time of slavery, and people were prohibited from reading books, right? So that a culture developed also around not valuing education. And so that mindset, linking with the old crackers in the South, that seems like that fits together perfectly well. If that they had a culture that they already had that type of attitude, and then you had the Southern blacks who were forced to basically develop that type of attitude, you can see how that would be influential. Let's get some more.
What the rednecks or crackers brought with them across the ocean was a whole constellation of attitudes, values, and behavior patterns that might have made sense in the world in which they had lived for centuries, but which would prove to be counterproductive in the world to which they were going, and counterproductive to the blacks who would live in their midst for centuries before emerging into freedom and migrating to the great urban centers of the United States, taking with them similar values. The cultural values and social patterns prevalent among Southern whites included an aversion to work, proneness to violence, neglect of education, sexual promiscuity, improvidence, drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship, reckless searches for excitement, lively music and dance, and a style of religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery.
So from the British Isles, Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying that they brought much of that culture over to the South, which Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying was counterproductive. And it may have worked and been productive where they came from in that particular environment, but coming over to the United States of America, a different setting, different environment, different atmosphere, it required a different cultural approach, right? And so many of those attitudes that they had, neglecting education, aversion to work, violence, promiscuity, a reckless search for entertainment and excitement, lively music and dance. These are some of the cultural practices that were counterproductive when they came over to the United States of America. And as I mentioned before, and I'll continue mentioning, that the blacks in the South, they're in a predicament and in a circumstance at that time where they're forced to develop many of these counterproductive cultural attitudes and practices. So when you have the folks coming over from the British Isles with those type of customs, I can see how much of the blacks during that time felt drawn towards many of these other cultural practices. Here we go.
This oratorical style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and has continued on into our own times among black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization were also part of this redneck culture among people from regions of Britain, where the civilization was the least developed.
So what is this boastful, emotionally filled oratorical style that was brought over from the least developed areas of the British Isles and developed by blacks? What does that look like? It's probably something like this.
The church has gotten so far removed from Jesus that it takes 3,000 church members 1 full year to win one person to Jesus. But I got news for you. We're getting closer to his return. And the closer we get to him, the faster things are going to happen. The faster the healings, the faster the deliverance, the faster...
out of life what you chose to get, you would not be in the church tonight. But God messed up your plans in order to draw you in and set you where He wanted you to be. Caused some stuff to break, and it broke supernaturally.
So we can see that both of them have a very similar style. They have this like emotionally excited type of dramatic oratorical style, which Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying that doesn't come from the enslaved blacks. He's saying that comes from the British Isles, the least developed areas in the British Isles, and that they brought that oratorical style over here, and it was adopted by the people during the time of slavery. And obviously, people in West Africa, they were not doing that type of style. So it either developed in the enslaved environment, or, like Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying, it came over from those that came from the British Isles. And so now moving on in the book, it talks about how the old rednecks were a very proud people and how they had cracker pride, which was very similar to what is known as the black pride. And Dr. Thomas Sowell states that this was not the type of pride that someone would have who has some type of large industrial development or who has discovered something that's beneficial. This was a different type of pride. It's a pride that took no level of disrespect. And the old cracker culture supposedly had a culture that was steeped in violence, in which many members of that culture and that society encouraged violence. And they had different forms of violence of biting ears off and gouging out eyes. Wild stuff that is being reported is coming from that culture, right? And so when we read in the book, there's an instance where there's two people who are supposed to be friends and good friends at that. And one of the friends said something to the other, and the other one took it as a level of disrespect, right? And got offended over the comment that the other supposed friend had made. And as a result of this, they got their rifles and they went and dueled it out, right? This is how serious this culture was when it came to disrespecting people. And so they dueled it out and they fought it out with the guns until one of them was laid to rest. And so what was also surprising about this narrative in the book is that the people who drew near to the duel when it was getting ready to happen, they encouraged it, right? This is the mindset that they had. They encouraged it and they pretty much instigated it on. And then the person who won the duel, they cheered that person on and they pretty much raised his social value, the killer.
Again, what is important here is not the isolated incident itself, but the set of social attitudes which allow such incidents to take place publicly with impunity, the killer knowing in advance that what he was doing had community approval. Moreover, such attitudes went back for centuries on both sides of the Atlantic, at least among the particular people concerned.
What attitudes? We're talking about the attitudes of praising people who commit murders and do killings, and also encouraging people to go out and duel, to fight, to battle, to clash amongst each other. Notice that it says in here that these attitudes go back for centuries. What does that mean? That these attitudes continue to find avenues of expression through people, right? Humans are like customizable characters, meaning any type of social values, morals, cultural practices, any and every type of human could express that. And so these attitudes here of glorifying criminals and encouraging people to duel and all this, he's saying that this is going back for centuries and finding expression in the people of the British Isles in those lowest levels of development, then finding avenues of expression throughout the enslaved blacks in the South, and then continuing on into the black culture and black community. Right? Finding avenues of expression until people say, you know what, we don't want to partake in those type of values, morals, cultural practices. We want to replace that with something else. Why? Because humans are customizable, right? They don't have to keep one thing and one thing only. You can continue to change, pick up things, drop things. You can do that when you understand the human power of creativity and will.
During the era when dueling became a pattern among upper-class Americans, between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, it was particularly prevalent in the South. As a social history of the United States noted, quote, of Southern statesmen who rose to prominence after 1790, hardly one can be mentioned who was not involved in a duel, end quote. Editors of Southern newspapers became involved in duels so often that cartoonists depicted them with a pen in one hand and a dueling pistol in the other. Most duels arose not over substantive issues, but over words considered insulting.
So bringing out the pistol to duel was prevalent in the late 1700s. And what's interesting and eye-catching about this account here is that people are not dueling over like major problems. People are dueling over petty things, right? Someone's feelings got hurt. Someone feels offended. They're ready to get up, pull the pistol out, and put somebody to death. Now, this attitude here is something that was ingrained into the Southern culture, right? And so we can see aspects of this that have worked its way into the black culture, where you can have things that are very insignificant, such as staring at somebody, stepping on someone's shoes, calling somebody a name, right? All these types of petty types of encounters and instances and circumstances, many of these things could get you killed. And if they don't get you killed for sure, then a fight can start out of one of these instances, right? And so what Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying is that these types of attitudes come from the redneck cracker culture, right? That's where it's coming from. Here we go.
Nor is it hard to recognize in these attitudes clear parallels to the behavior and attitudes of ghetto gangs today, who kill over a look or a word or any action that can be construed as dissing them.
Do we see any similarities? Yes, we do. And that's why it's time for certain people to resurrect from the dead and move away from those type of cultural attitudes and practices, or else you'll continue to be a perpetual slave. Here we go.
Pride had yet another side to it. Among the definitions of a cracker in the Oxford Dictionary is a braggart, one who talks trash, in today's vernacular, a wisecracker. More than mere wisecracks were involved, however. The pattern is once said by Professor McWhiney to go back to descriptions of ancient Celts as, quote, boasters and threateners, and given to bombastic self-dramatization, end quote. Examples today come readily to mind, not only from ghetto life and gangster rap, but also from militant black leaders, spokesmen, or activists. What is painfully ironic is that such attitudes and behavior are projected today as aspects of a distinctive black identity, when in fact they are part of a centuries-old pattern among the whites and whose missed generations of blacks live in the South.
Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying that it is painfully ironic that blacks think that the trash-talking, bragging, prideful, dramatic type of attitude that they express is solely, distinctly, and uniquely a black invention. He's saying that that's not the case. He's saying, but rather the fact is that that attitude comes from white Southerners and crackers and rednecks who brought that culture over from the least developed areas in the British Isles, right? And then eventually the blacks adopted those attitudes for themselves, right? And in a sense, one could look at this in a case of saying, that people who participate in those type of attitudes and those type of cultural practices, that they, in a sense, are, quote, acting white, right? And it is very ironic, right, when you look at it from that light. And so this is the conclusion of the first part in the book here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And so what we have to understand is that no culture develops uniquely and distinctly on its own, right? And that all cultures have some type of influence from others. And it just so happened to be that the cracker culture and the redneck culture was something that was assimilable and attractive to those that were enslaved. And when you read in the book, The Cracker Culture by Dr. Grady McWhiney, he talks about it how the cracker culture and the redneck culture was very influential and highly contagious to people who were surrounded by it. And so the Old South took on a lot of those practices, right? Because we can see it today in the black culture that it is a highly contagious culture, right? And it's easy to influence people with that type of behavior and those type of ways of thinking. And so what's also important to understand is that the people who brought that culture over to the United States of America, their descendants, the vast majority of them, left that culture behind, right? And they went and picked up other cultural practices that were more fitting, and they left those cultural practices behind. And what happened is the blacks who adopted those cultural practices, they took them, They modify them and they also mature them to a certain extent, right? And they have taken those cultural practices and basically hugged on tight to them as if it was something that was just uniquely and distinctly an invention of blacks. And we can see from the information here that that is just not the case. And so stay tuned for part 2, because we're going to be going into the redneck cultural influence on attitudes towards working and also intellectual thinking. So I want to thank you for watching the video here. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 2.